After witnessing the mirror change into something that wasn't a mirror, we all bolted. We didn't clean up at all. We ended up running out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We went upstairs, and my brothers went directly outside screaming, "What the fuck was that? What the fuck was that? Oh man!" at the top of their lungs. I was just confused as the rest of them and tried to tell them, but they were not exactly in a listening mood. I kept a death grip on the jewelry as I yelling continued. Thankfully, my friend calmed the situation down. When we went back in the house, we had to keep the door and windows open to keep the smell down. Just think of the most rancid fart you've ever experienced, and take that smell and rub it so far up your nose it ends up on your tongue, and you get a rough idea. Sitting at the table, we broke out the liquor and started to talk while we drank. The conversation was all about what we saw when the mirror changed. Here's what we came up with. First, we figured this was mystic energy and nothing else. Reason being is that our electronics, phones, to watches, nothing malfunctioned. Though it is true that energy is energy, basic physics will tell you that the waves and frequencies matter just as much. Second, is that whatever is showed to us had to be underground. The lack of fresh air and sunlight made that perfectly clear. This, compiled with the obviously masonry work, was used out of natural formations to their advantage. Now, my brother knows construction so much better than I do. He said that the supports were placed and sized in a way he believes that there is a very heavy structure above it. The third point was something we didn't want to talk about. The place was clearly a dungeon or prison of sorts. Bars for the doors and people chained to the walls made that pretty damn obvious. We noticed a female chained to the wall, and even though my brothers didn't have the training my friend and I do, it made them want to go in shooting something. This brought up the fourth point, the smell. We really didn't know what was in the air that made it so wretched to inhale. This could be a major concern. My friend was a medic after all and said that with that much methane, it would make an entire bit volatile, to say the least, if you decide to light anything off. I brought up the leather gear with the blades, and they wanted me to go get it. When I showed them, they all agreed that this was probably the reason for the blades. My little brother knows metals. Hell, he's the one that cast our bullets for hunting season. He mentioned how the metal and the blades were made of some sort of titanium alloy. I know what this means, just not how to make it work. Regardless, no medieval society had that type of metal. Since we had been drinking, though, the guys had to call their wives and tell them that we would be staying over. As a general rule, once you start drinking, keys stay in the pockets. We all know at least one person who didn't follow that rule and paid for it dearly. So, over a couple pizzas and some sodas and maybe a couple beers, need to mix some liquor in that soda somehow, too. We moved on to our fifth point. This was how do we traverse the area, or even can we go in without gasping and unknown factors with the air? The kicker is that you can pick up the sensors needed at the nearest hardware store. With all these factors discussed at great length, we made a plan to get what we needed to start testing the next day. I was mainly focused on the security aspects of it, although since firearms might cause an explosion, I looked into items of lethality but no ignition. Turns out the old meets the new on this one. I picked up 4 heavy-duty crossbows with a mix of solid shafts or bolts, and of course a couple hollow ones just for some distance. Oddly enough, it was the heads that cost the most. You see, I study history. I've studied military history for decades now, and I'm pretty well versed on what we may be encountering. This means we need everything from long-range, fresh mangling bolt to a solid armor-piercing bolt. This means a mix of heads as well. I was a little shy on body armor, but a tip of surplus store, and we had enough to cover ourselves. Even picked up a couple of riot shields for the heavy price. The hard part was finding swords and spears that weren't shitty reproductions. Thankfully, an old friend I knew had the ability to hook me up. He started asking a few questions I wasn't sure I should answer. You see, he's a really good man, but his health would not be an asset at all. It kind of hurt me to keep him in the dark, though. After leaving his shop, I had to refill my scuba tank, too. Yes, I dive, but I'm just a level 1 diver. Just increase the need for fresh air in a hurry, anyway. My brothers got the detector kits along with supplies to make a makeshift ballista. The Romans called it a scorpion. Along with forging some solid metal bolts for it. We tested it outside and it punched straight through a concrete block which was holding the piece of plywood we were shooting at. My friend was a medic, so he focused mainly on that, though he had his own gear which made it a whole lot easier to get everybody covered. This whole process took about 2 days, and we were ready to try the mirror again. We all got ready behind the ballista, and it was primed and ready to fire. We used our flashlights to make sure the mirror didn't change before we were ready. We had our gear on, body armor, crossbows ready to shoot, with each have at least 6 knives in a piece. Our swords were ready, and we pulled out our respirators. The tank of air was good to go, with the regulator hooked up to the corner. With final checks on the sensors, we lit the lanterns and turned off the flashlights. I should mention that both my friend and I and our GoPros prior to lighting the lanterns. I even had on the table the mirrors started to light and the reflections faded to reveal the same god-awful scene. This time, there were far more personnel chained to the wall. A mixture of male and female bodies were chained up naked. Now, this wouldn't have shocked us, except for the fact that they were different colors. And I don't mean Caucasian, East Indian, Asian, African colors. No. There were few with almost pale white skin, others with black, as in coal black skin. A couple looked purple. There was even 3 or 4 that looked red or blue. It was surreal to see this. It only took a few moments before the air in the place filled our senses and we came right back to reality. We started taking air measurements, finding out things like the methane and hydrogen sulfide. The oxygen levels were very low, but not low enough to knock you out. I think of it kind of like high altitudes. We didn't have much time as my brothers that only had the respirators over their mouth and noses began to complain that it was burning their eyes. This is when my friend noticed something we hadn't before. Everyone chained up had their eyes closed. We thought it was weird, but we were the only ones there for measurements. We got what we needed, and my friend and I blew out the lanterns. It took a while, though, for the mirror to go back. It might have been only about 10 to 15 seconds, but it was still kind of uncomfortable watching the image slowly fade and then the reflections of ourselves return. We took our measurements upstairs, checked them against charts that we'd printed out. The methane was high enough that it went in the danger zone for combustion. But the air itself was breathable. I wasn't taking any chances and said I would be wearing my M40 protective mask. My brothers nodded as they rubbed their eyes, I guess realizing how damaged the fumes were to their eyes. It was the next morning when we were ready to go and walked through the mirror. I could see the look of fear on my brothers' faces as they had never been on a mission before. Hell, one is a building contractor and the other's in IT. My friend seemed a bit hesitant to put his gear to be used during deployments. I offered for him to stay, but he responded, "I'm in far too deep now." I smiled and gave him a nod, and we went downstairs into that small room. It was decided that I would go first. Then my friend would follow. My brothers would pull security in case something went wrong. They both have wives and children, so just in case something went wrong, I wasn't going to risk it. I should note here that we figured out why the jewelry activates the way it does. You see, it needs pure light, not artificial light like from an LED. Flame or sun would be enough as long as it's direct line of sight to the mirror itself. Seems like a lot to go through, but you are looking at possibly crossing dimensions, so fuck it. We lit the lanterns, and the jewels began to glow again, as you imagine, and the image came into view. There seemed to be more this time, more humanoids chained up or laid out across the area. I started to relay final instructions to my brothers as I began to move forward. I freely admit I was shaking inside. I don't know if it was the adrenaline, fear, or maybe a mix of the two, but it was difficult to keep my voice steady as I stepped forward. My friend spoke up, saying, "Okay, I'm right behind you." When he said this, someone must have heard him because I could hear yelling. One of the chained persons had opened their eyes and was calling for us. This made the others open their eyes and began to start yelling in a language I just did not understand. This must have got someone's attention because you could hear a booming voice echoing through the hall. This was enough to make me hesitate before even stepping through the mirror, and thank God for that. That is when, as I thought, this thing had walked through the camera shot, or at least it seemed that way, as something just suddenly appeared in front of us. It just appeared and walked away, yelling at one of the creatures being held. It turned to one of the females and addressed her in a way that made my blood boil. This thing was really large, looked rather fat too, with tusk-like teeth and almost hoof-like feet. Its nose was pushed flat as though someone had knocked it up 60 degrees. The eyes were narrow like it was trying to squint out the light. First it struck the female and then grabbed her ass. I should have seen what was coming next. My brothers both have children. One has a young daughter. Though I didn't see it, I'm sure it was the one who fired the ballista at that thing. The bolt hit the creature before it even had a chance to react. It flew and pierced the creature right in the ass. It actually went from left to right and skewered both cheeks. The creature yelled in pain and fell back, landing on its own injury, and then began to scream again from the sudden burst of pain. I knew this was bad, and I didn't have much choice. I moved forward and raised my crossbow. Stepping through the mirror, I fired and caught the creature in the neck. 3 more bolts came out shortly. 2 pierced the abdomen, and the third hit the side of its head. The creature slumped, and that was the end of it. Quickly, I pulled the line, recocking the bow and setting another bolt. I proceeded to clear the room the way I've been trained. The only difference is that I only had a one-shot weapon. When I looked back to the mirror, I could see right through to my brothers on the other side. Coming out of my training, I began to look at what the mirror had done. Looking close, I could see that somehow it had breached the 4th dimension. The gate into this place was only as thick as the mirror itself. There was nothing behind it. I was having trouble holding my bladder as my mind struggled with the physics. My friend had come through and was yelling at me to keep my guard up. That is when we finally got a good look at who, or in this case what, was chained to the walls. No amount of fantasy reading or CGI watching could have prepared for what we saw. These humanoids, they're fucking elves, man. Not like Santa's helpers, but straight out of fantasy literature elves. The first one was the young female chained on the wall. I placed her age maybe 12 to 14. Her skin was almost solid black, and I don't mean the same way as you want to put it, but true, honest to God, solid black with like crystalline white hair. She looked like something had beat the shit out of her and was not even wearing anything. The only part that was truly, elf category was the telltale ears. She winced as I reached up to her chains to see if I could get them removed. That is when it hit me, to check the creature to just see if it had keys on it. Unfortunately, no joy. Frustrated, I stood up and kicked the corpse, cursing as he didn't have them on him. That is when a few of these elves started making noise, which I'm assuming was their language, and pointed at the wall near the front door. Sure enough, that is where the keys were hanging. I walked over to get them, and as I did, I could see my friend was trying to patch up those in the cells. I forgot to mention that many of those not chained to the wall had clear battle damage. Most of it was blunt force trauma or lacerations. There was a few puncture wounds as well, just not nearly as many. It was clear that they had been brought here by force. This made my blood boil as I grabbed the keys and began to unlock the chains. I only unlocked 3 before I handed the keys to one of them and ran to my friend. He was frantically trying to save another young female, maybe about 10 years old. I helped him with the CPR, and we did what we could. A minute later, he was suturing her up as she was barely holding on. Turning around, I could see that most of the elves had been freed, but many of the others required medical attention. I yelled for my big brother to come and help, and he hesitantly walked through to us. We guessed that they were thanking us in a way they were acting, but we couldn't understand a word they were saying. One of the females came crying to me and held up a young boy for me to see. I set him down and did what I could. A few minutes later, my friend grabbed me by the arm and gave me a look, the one that said, It's too late, man." The female started crying while being consoled by another. This truly made my blood boil with levels of hate I haven't felt in years. I used what I had to save as many as I could. With each casualty, I just saw I was hoping for something, anything, for me to empty my rage on. Well, I didn't have to wait too long. Another booming yell came from down the tunnel, and we had to maneuver to see around the mirror entrance. At least 3 or 4 of those monstrous things were coming. Each of them had a weapon of some sort in their hands, though only one carried an actual blade. This was bad enough, but there were even more prisoners who had not even seen from the mirror. I cursed as I drew up and fired, putting the bolt into the chest of one of them. It staggered for a moment and then just kept coming. Seeing this, I called out for my little brother to stay and only fire when he has a clear shot. He was yelling at me that he couldn't see what was going on, but honestly, I didn't care at that point. My friend was able to put a bolt into one of the monster's eyes. It slowed down its charge and came to a walk before dropping to the ground as the bolt had somehow made it to its brain. My big brother tried to do the same, but ended up just hitting the monster's open mouth. It dropped to its knees as blood began to pour from its throat, but it didn't stop it. The monsters kept getting closer, and I yelled out to my little brother to get ready. He must have been, because the moment one of those monsters passed by the mirrors, and it seemed to our perspective that the monster just walked through it, almost like a hologram. My brother fired the ballista. The solid metal bolt skewed the monster, sticking halfway out of its lower chest as the rest was still sticking out its back. This was enough to make the other pause. Good thing, too, because it gave us time to lock another bolt in our crossbows and fire. This time, 2 crossbows hit the monster's face while the third pierced its neck. It simply collapsed onto the ground. The last one got up in a rage as it spit out blood and charged. I didn't have time to lock another bolt before a massive arm launched my 200-pound ass into the wall. Instantly, I was praying that it was my plates that broke instead of my ribs. My brother and friend fired and backed away in time and were trying to get their arrows set. This thing threw its club-type weapon at them, forcing them to duck away. While this happened, one of the elves had come up to me, drew the sword. I forgot I even had that thing on me. He slashed at the monster's leg and must have severed the tendons because it instantly dropped to one knee and couldn't get up. It turned and saw the mirror entrance for the first time. It paused in confusion, and that must have been its last thought it had. Another solid metal bolt came flying through, catching it at the center of the chest and forcing the monster to flip back. The tip fell onto the floor, and the body it held up 2 feet off the ground. The weight of the monster caused it to slowly slide down the bolt until it was on the ground. With that, the fight was over. A couple of the elves helped me up. As I staggered to get my feet back under myself, my friend came over to see if I was all right, though we wouldn't know anything till I got to a hospital. At least I wasn't coughing blood, though, and I was sure I would end up pissing some. I called for status, but only my friend knew what to say. He helped me over to the mirror door, and I sat on one of the monsters that had been shot through the back. I tried to catch my breath, though that mask did not make it easy. As I sat, others were freed from their chains, and many came over, seeming to thank us. I didn't know why. They were still stuck in a dungeon underground somewhere. I did have time to get a much better look at all these different color elves. Though relatively human, they seemed to be much leaner than the average human. They seem to speak a similar language, but it's clear that they are not from the same tribes. Each of the colors seemed to rally together with their own for the most part, though they did converse with each other. Some of them had insignias on them, either burned or tattooed. With little observation, it was clear that there was more influential ones in the group, at least a little. With one of the purple ones, with all its decorations on it, said something loud to the other purple ones. She was quickly knocked to the floor. From her reaction and the look of shock as she caressed the side of her face looking up at the others, I'm guessing she'd never been treated like that before. Guess no matter what world you're in, some things don't change. Friggin' elitist pains in the... Once I got my bearings, I told the others I was going to check the rest of the area. I yelled to my big brother to guard the mirror and my little brother to start getting water. Some of the elves looked like they were extremely dehydrated. I took a walk and found that the area was far bigger than we thought. There was enough room to imprison several hundred without even a single issue. Hell, if you stacked them in, you could get 1,000 in for sure. As I looked into some of the other cells, I was shocked to see that there were other species as well. Well, what was left of them anyway. There were a type of lizard people, a bunch of different types of animals ranging in sizes of a small dog to the size of an adolescent elephant. These bodies were not that old either, which is why I could tell what they were, but beyond that, they were well beyond the ability to save. The area ended up with a solid man-made wall. I had made note of the masonry work before heading back. When I got back, I could see my brother had gotten the water and had even gotten some old clothes for them. Though I may be of a conservative mindset, I'm still a guy and wouldn't have minded the ladies going without clothes for just a little while longer. My friend was able to go into the mirror and come back with more medical supplies. Things like large gauze, rolls of medical tape, and of course antibiotics. We were very limited on that last one, but I was sure glad to see that I put them to good use. An older male came up to me. My eyes leveled off at his red jawline as he spoke. I just stood there as he talked, but I still had no idea what he was saying. Judging from his movements, he was thanking me for his help, but I didn't know what else he said. I called over my brothers and friend, and we started discussing our next move. We didn't have enough to feed them. That was our problem. We had no layout of the land either. What the hell are we going to do now? We can't just leave them to be put back in chains. The moral question around for a while until the bunch of the elves started to yell. We looked and there was light approaching the prison door. Since the door was set up like a prison cell door, it was easy to see it coming. Soon, men in armor stood there yelling. They seemed to be yelling at the elves and not at us. It was understandable since those fat monster bodies were obstructing most of our view. I stood up and looked at one of them and said something to the man. And that man ran back from the direction they'd come. The one in charge must have noticed me because he stopped dead and stared.